Without doubt, the most dominant faction of recent WWE history, and perhaps of all time. The Bloodline have found themselves at the center of arguably the most compelling long-term saga of the last decade. But do you honestly feel like you know absolutely everything there is to know about this dominant family of tribal chiefs, Usos, and final bosses? Well, let's find out, eh? Because I am Gareth, this is WhatCulture Wrestling, and this epic video right here is about to take a deep dive into the truly fascinating secret WWE history of the Bloodline. Acknowledge me! Or them, either or. By joining forces almost a decade after they first teased the idea, God we're getting old, The Rock and Roman Reigns set the wheels in motion for a WrestleMania season like few WWE had ever booked before. The Rock embraced his beloved Hollywood heel persona and turned the volume, violence, and bad language higher up than ever before. Meanwhile, the WWE Universal Heavyweight WWE Champion of the Universe and the Galaxy also had to up his game really just to try and keep pace with his cousin who was just killing it every time he got in front of a camera. To be fair, he did slow play it, but knowing in the back of his mind just how well everything was going to play out by the time we got to night 2 in the main event against Cody Rhodes. A night when the spotlight shined brightest on both the champion and the challenger. By folding all of this together with a literal backdrop of the Bloodline family tree in all its PowerPoint glory for the very first time during the build-up, WWE were able to weave together the most charismatic performers, the biggest money drawers, and the deepest familial lore. All of this made for the perfect 1-2 punch of WWE's biggest nights of the year. But the grand finale to WrestleMania XL couldn't have possibly occurred without the, let's say, divisive ending to WrestleMania 39 a year earlier, right? The very long game was actually the preferred pathway for all involved. Apart from Cody Rhodes. What looked and very much felt like a Vince McMahon call on the weekend that he tried to really force his way back into Gorilla. Yep, we all remember that Raw after WrestleMania, don't we? Well, that actually turned out to be something that he, Triple H, and Roman Reigns all came to an agreement on, weirdly enough. Rhodes' disappointment that night was as undeniable as his rise, though. He started his story with a fabulous post-debut promo on the Raw after his WrestleMania 38 return. And to put a bow on it just a year later was seemingly perfect justification for the bold career move that he made. The tale, tall as some of it may be, but don't forget, wrestling is and always will be a work, and Cody Rhodes is one of the best workers out there, was that he had to make up for a kayfabe crime committed against his father back in 1977. There, the American Dream had defeated then WWF champion superstar Billy Graham by countout, and he then excitedly held the title above his head before being reminded of the champion's advantage. Oh, it's heartbreaking stuff. The belt was wrestled away before he had a chance to have it for real, and with that, Cody had a ready-made rationale to right a wrong 45 years later. That particular feeling was actually painfully familiar for Cody Rhodes in 2023, and actually in some ways, it was a little bit worse. He didn't even get a chance to lay a finger on that belt before he was left there, just sat in the middle of the ring, clutching his knees and trying his best not to make eye contact with the rubber chicken. The 1970s and 2020s couldn't be any further apart in many respects. But here, the parallel was brutal, a name with heritage once again being blocked from breaking new ground. You hate to see it. In an odd quirk of fate, though, this was actually a dose of history repeating itself. In the same year Rhodes was stopped just short of dethroning Billy Graham, Peter Maivia was making waves of his own. Initially a well-regarded and visually arresting babyface with half his body covered in tattoo ink, Maivia was a fearsome heel opposite Bob Backlund, you know, the person who would actually go on to defeat Billy Graham in 1978. The links and bonds between then and now go much, much deeper, of course, as they would for generations to come. But the High Chief's time at the top would sadly be short-lived. He passed away from cancer in 1981 at just 45 years old. Sadly, not living long enough to see the fruits of his labor and blood bond with a Mituani Anoa'i. Man, I hope I said that right. Peter and the Mituani's oath to one another unified the Maivias and the Anoa'is into one massive family unit, bringing together the wrestlers that emerged in enormous numbers on either side. A Mituani was the father of Afa and Sika, you know, the wild Samoans. Yeah, those guys. This pair won tag gold pretty much everywhere they went, really, and that's including for Vince McMahon Sr. and Jr. during separate runs in 1978 and 1985. Impressive stuff. Cast as, well, barely evolved humans beyond fighting, eating, and having hard heads, Afa and Sika, well, They excelled in the spots, and they kept kayfabe at all times, ensuring that the audience's fear of the unknown remained the unique selling point. It was during this time that the family business extended outwards too. Our first son Samu joined as alternate Samula before working briefly as a babyface when the Samoans left the company. And their final tag team title defeat came at the hands of Tony Atlas and a certain Rocky Johnson. The latter was family by marriage, having wedded Ata Maivia, with the two of those eventually having a son called Dwayne. Yep, that Dwayne, we'll get to him later. And as the decade and company continued to change, so too did the landscape for what was rapidly becoming a wrestling dynasty in the McMahon territory. The babyface Tonga Kid was repackaged as Tama. Tonga Kid was the son of Yalawalo Falau Salofa Fatu Sr. and Elavera Anoa'i, and he was the brother of Edward Umaga Fatu and Salofa Rikishi Fatu. And after that Tama change, he would link up with Tonga Haku Fifita to form the Islanders. They quickly joined the Heenan family to pad out what was perhaps the most stacked tag division in WWE history at the time, making it onto pay-per-view in the company's enormous Survivor Series tag team match in 1987. They'd also make it to the show of shows in a WrestleMania 4 showdown with the British Bulldogs. Haku is of course another person who helps tie the past to the present right now, because he's the uncle and adoptive father of none other than Tama Tonga, who joined the Bloodline. And he would also prove to be a prominent figure with the company until his departure in 1992. That was 2 whole years before I was even born. He was one of several from the company's golden era to depart whilst the organisation was in a state of flux. But the year was to be one of the most profound for the ever-growing Maivia Anoa'i family tree. More and more branches blossomed, and having gained raise for their work as the Samoan SWAT team in Puerto Rico and WCW, Salofa Fatu and Samuel Anoa'i were about to make the biggest moves of their career and have a transformative effect on the market leader. But before we get there, I've got a quick question for you. Who is your favourite member of the entire Bloodline family tree? It's a big tree. Pick a name, say which one you like, put it in the comments. In an era where time moves substantially quicker than it ever does now in wrestling, the Headshrinkers lived a surprisingly full and fruitful life in WWE. And while it'd be untrue to say that all the familiar stereotypes yet again weren't adhered to, it'd be reasonable to also add that the more the company tried to modernise the aesthetic, the less believable it became. Arriving in 1992 alongside manager and mentor figure Arthur, Fatu and Samu made an immediate impact as heels when they were credited with costing the natural disasters the tag team championships against Money Inc. The disasters were done within months of losing the belt, whereas the Shrinkers, they went from strength to strength. Off the back of their influential interference, Samu and Fatu moved on to the Survivor Series for their pay-per-view debut, one that contained a victory over Owen Hart and Coco Beware's High Energy. And on the first WWE pay-per-view without one or both of either Hulk Hogan or the Ultimate Warrior, the impressive work from both units was a temporary statement of intent from the company that it was finally time to move on. Kept far away from a lifeless titular Royal Rumble match in 1993, the Headshrinkers' natural WrestleMania opponents revealed themselves in yet another killer doubles opener on the show. The Steiner brothers battered the Beverly brothers, and then suddenly WWE had 2 brand new tag team duos just to go to war with each other on the grandest stage. Now Hulk Hogan's eventual 1993 return would go on to cause, well, greater problems, let's say, and we will get to them, don't worry. But one of them impacting Fatu, Samu, Rick and Scott was that their potential outing was now probably not going to be over the tag team championships. Hogan's return ostensibly only occurred so he could defend the honour of Brutus Beefcake after the barber was brutalised by Money Inc. Ted DiBiase and IRS was still on top at this point, and consequently the Hulkster was suddenly vying for a different prize, and the belts were going to form part of a double main event thing alongside Bret Hart's WWE Championship battle with Yokozuna. Nothing would be as simple as any of that sounds on the night, of course, but one constant remained for everyone inside of that dolled up Caesar's Palace car park. The Headshrinkers and the Steiner brothers were all about beating the absolute bejesus out of one another. Match of the night on the show of shows by such a margin that it almost embarrassed the rest of the roster and the booking. The 4 worked as daylight turned to dusk, but lit up Las Vegas like few others. There is an amazing spot where Rick just suplexes an airborne Samu whilst he's on top of Fatu's shoulders. More so than Afa and Sika ever had, and relying less on the cheap heat the Islanders often leaned hard into, the Headshrinkers were quickly becoming known as one of the company's rare for the time work rate acts. This was further enhanced by some stellar television singles matches too, such as Fatu's run against Bret Hart on a pre-WrestleMania Raw and Samu's choice effort against Mr. Perfect during the company's then still profitable 1993 UK Rampage tour. Now the houses at that point weren't exactly getting any bigger, but just because the company wasn't drawing going, it didn't mean that opportunities weren't available for the acts that still continued to connect. Leading from the front, the Hitman was the embodiment of the philosophical shift the company desperately needed, but he couldn't do it alone. Underneath him, you had Shawn Michaels, who was just as ready for the whole challenge. And only slightly below him, you had the likes of Razor Ramon, the 1-2-3 Kid, Mr. Perfect, Bam Bam Bigelow, and Matt Bourne's incredible turn as Doink. Absolutely all of these were asking more of WWE fans' attention, bell to bell, than at any other point in company history. In the same vein, Samu, Fatu, and the Steiner brothers stayed at the very tippy top of the tag division, with the likes of the Smoking Guns and the Quebecers shoring things up a little underneath. Where there was less money to be made per night, WWE just decided to run more nights. The Killer Calendar was a schedule of events that WWE added to the in-house magazine during the mid-90s, but the wacky alliteration was strictly the preserve of the sub-editors. The wrestlers actually named it for how hard life was hitting endless small towns for endless smaller payoffs. But even now, the quality of the actual wrestling, if not all of the booking, holds up. There was a paradox at play across most of North America, with WCW also struggling. As box office returns diminished, the wrestlers theoretically never held less value to Vince McMahon, Ted Turner, and any other promoter who looked to market the world's best pro wrestling. But making towns and sending fans home happy had actually never been more crucial to the bottom line. And the best of the 1993 crop promised a substantially better night's entertainment than many of the bloated charlatans that defined the past. Give me Brett, Shawn, Razor, and 1-2-3 Kid bumping around a ring any day. Unfortunately though, the year was to end on a humiliating low for the Headshrinkers. The reps and the bumps had taken them so far, but the industry was light years behind social norms. And never was this clearer than in the multifariously embarrassing 4 Doinks versus Team Bam Bam Bigelow Survivor Series match. As commentator and booker of the damn thing, Vince McMahon referred to the whole scene as, well, a cartoon. Men on a mission and the Bushwhackers donned the face paint, and they then fooled Fatu, Samu, and their partner Bastion Booger with distractions that range from balloons and scooters to, most insultingly, Thanksgiving turkey. Yep. That's what happened. The dated savages stereotype was back for the night, and to such an extent that even Afa couldn't fight the past. The three succumbed to their supposed instincts here, choosing to excitedly pick at pieces of raw meat rather than trying to win a match. It was a grim watch. It was all done in the worst possible taste and performed as disgustingly as possible. Brighter days were ahead, but if ever a match existed to mark the end of something, this at least stood as an early farewell to the Headshrinkers as heels. Linking up with Yokozuna, don't worry, we'll get to him later, to help the WWE champion at the time dump The Undertaker into a casket and retain his championship, proved to be one of their last real acts on the wrong side of the tracks. After Samu unleashed his terrifying hangman spot in the 1994 Royal Rumble, and Fatu even made it to the final 4 of the damn thing, Arthur's men were suddenly in the frame with fans as men to respect rather than just simply fear. Their last pay-per-view match as heels didn't even actually take place. Let me explain. Part of the random assortment 10-man tag team match that was cut from the show due to Shawn Michaels and Razor Ramon's ladder match going long, the contest instead took place on a Monday Night Raw taping cycle that solidified the turning point. Prolific 1970s and 80s manager Captain Lou Albano was brought into the company with a view of finding his next tag team success story. And he then formed a bond with Afa on the grounds that the two were both just the right side of insane. Yep, that'll do it. Tag team champions the Quebecers were the unit in the crosshairs, having tried and failed to manipulate the Headshrinkers into joining them as a way of just not having to defend their belts against them. Survivor Series 1993 may as well have been a different universe to the one that Samu and Fatu were now currently occupying. They were now wise enough to the cowardice, and it wasn't long before they became tag team champions. It was smart and logical booking in the face of characterizations that sometimes inspired, well, low-hanging fruit creative, let's say. By listening to Albano's advice, Fatu, Samu, and Afa were all able to see another way through, and were rewarded in kind with the gold they'd craved for nearly 2 years. They got there in the end. It was best of time stuff, even if the times had arrived just a little bit too late. Because Albano's teachings had been vindicated and the pair were now babyfaces, well, WWE deemed the natural next step to be all about Americanizing them. It was a patronizing backward step and the first of many. The pair defeated Yokozuna and Crush in the King of the Ring in June, but that proved to be their only pay-per-view title defense. Bit of a bummer. Exactly one night ahead of taking on IRS and Bam Bam Bigelow in an effort to push back the rise of Ted DiBiase's $1 million corporation at SummerSlam 1994, they were just beaten on a house show by Shawn Michaels and Diesel. Right then. It was absolutely inexplicable in the context of the tag match. The SummerSlam pay-per-view opener was completely redundant without the tag belts, but all ultimately became clear as the night wore on. Diesel lost his Intercontinental Championship against Razor Ramon, but the future dudes with attitudes now had the double straps to worry about. And this kept their program red hot, even if it extinguished the Headshrinkers' fire. Perception is reality more often than not in wrestling, and it was increasingly difficult not to view this run as a bit of a damp squib really after years of grinding away and working their asses off to get the spot. In lockstep with the loss, years of toil caught up with Samu too. He departed to physically heal, and WWE just decided to mine whatever remained of the act by adding in a repackaged barbarian going by his real name of Sione. The new Headshrinkers struggled like every sequel act with the prefix typically would, not least when the supposed humanizing of the act extended to Fatu being confused and frustrated at the presence of wrestling boots. Their contributions to the success of Michaels and Diesel's act came full circle in 1994, when they found themselves on the wrong end of Big Daddy Cool's rampage through the babyface ranks. But no payback came their way as HBK and Diesel roared their way into 1995. The Headshrinkers never appeared on pay-per-view for the company again, and they just disbanded with insultingly minimal fanfare in 1995 ahead of Sione heading to WCW, and Fatu then adding a beanie hat and leather jacket to the pair of wrestling boots that he'd magically become acquainted with. None of it made a difference despite his best efforts. His 1995 to 1997 period was perhaps the weirdest of his WWE runs, and seriously thick of the ground and dimpled buttocks that covers. With little to no attempt to thread the two worlds together, making a difference, Fatu found the former Headshrinker suddenly just decked out in the neon of the new generation, all with a backstory that took from his real life rather than, I don't know, everything that audiences had been asked to believe about him in the years prior. Gone was all the traditional Samoan iconography, and though that was obviously a giant leap forward when it came to stereotyping in wrestling, the fact that he'd never been booked like more of a loser went against whatever it was they were trying to achieve here. And by 1996, the former tag team champion was being put into a mask to work as the Sultan, a character 10 years out of date and even further away from what the industry actually needed. Great. Perhaps out of loyalty to the Samoan bloodline, or maybe just as a wink and a nod to the people who actually knew who was hiding underneath the mask, Sultan ended up getting an Intercontinental Championship match at WrestleMania 13 against Rocky Maivia of all people. After a predictable defeat, he was part of a post-match sequence which also featured Rocky Johnson. It was a family affair, hiding in plain sight long before both men had their lineages mined for an on-screen feud. One that would emerge from the most unexpected of circumstances is one way of putting it. But before exploring how Fatu's life changed forever, it is actually worth delving back into the Bloodline's family album to see where he got much of his inspiration from. Now, not to define one of the most underrated athletes in WWE history by his size from the off, but the years in which Yokozuna's physical stature grew alongside his status within the market leader were a sight to behold, folks. When Rodney Anoa'i debuted on WWE television in late 1992 as Mr. Fuji's newest Japanese discovery and an apparent sumo sensation, the need to highlight the fact that he was, in fact, Samoan was replaced by a desire to just put over how impressive and believably cast he was in the role. Now, once again, a Samoan wrestler was being reduced to a stereotype, sadly, but in one of those only in wrestling kind of moments, it wasn't even the traditional one anymore. Years later, and with just about every piece of archive footage purposed and then repurposed to an almost unusable point, WWE began a process of leafing through the rest of the tape library for dark main events, tape tryouts, and any other rarities they could polish up and release to the hardcores for us to just gobble up. Hardcores that had always known of, but never actually seen footage that really sounded too weird to be true. Alongside these gems emerged footage of Kokina, Anoa'i's working name before he signed with WWE, just going through the motions ahead of a block television taping around 6 months before Yokozuna emerged fully formed on the October 31st edition of Superstars. He wore many of the awesome Samoan traits here, a meaty frame that looked tough to compete against, alongside an engine that could run longer and harder than just about anybody else's. What he was not, until, well, he was sumo-sized, baby. But my goodness, all of that definitely changed once Yokozuna was introduced. And like many others during a commercially challenging 1992, his impact was immediate by necessity. The gasps in the buildings when he flattened feckless idiots into corners with his charging splash were audible, and the banzai drop was the exact finisher to give to a man of his monumental size. Now, the racially problematic connotations were soon to bite WWE in the ass, but in the short term, every aspect of his presentation was being viewed internally as a bit of a home run, and externally, people were definitely leaning in for a closer look. He debuted on pay-per-view at the 1992 Survivor Series, squashing Virgil on a show that had also seen his family members, the Headshrinkers, make a similar kind of noise in the tag division. In their case, it took commentators doubling down on their inherent threat after a win. But in Yoko's case, his victim spoke longest and loudest about WWE's literal new biggest threat. Yeah, sure, the late and wonderful Virgil couldn't quite nail the pronunciation of a Yokozuna, but he nailed pretty much everything else in the pained post-match promo that he cut after being battered by Yokozuna, cutting most of it horizontal, lying on a locker room bench after being put well and truly through the ringer. He went as far as to warn WWE champion Bret Hart that even he couldn't stop the wrath of Fuji's new monster. And as announcers continued to marvel at his squash wins, a stipulation crept into the promotion of the 1993 Royal Rumble that was about to change Rodney Anoa'i's life. Entering its 6th year as an attraction and 5th on pay-per-view, that year's Royal Rumble actually stood a good chance of being the least bought in the show's history. I mean, it was the 2nd supercard in a row not to feature Hulk Hogan or Ultimate Warrior, or by then, a raft of the stars that had defined WWE's Big Four to that point. WrestleMania 8 marked the end of that specific era, and while your Randy Savages and Mr. Perfects were still in pretty prominent spots, the turnover had still been huge enough to force the company to go with Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels in a pretty big way. WWE was under scrutiny for what would later morph into steroid distribution charges and the 1994 trial of Vince McMahon, and had barely managed to get past appalling abuse allegations that came to light in parallel with the government's drug investigation. The apparent smaller guys that could wrestle were in. I mean, they weren't really that small, were they? And the wrestlers with ginormous muscular physiques suddenly started to shrink or just disappear from television entirely. Vince McMahon always liked what he liked though, didn't he? And he had a steadfast belief that bigger was always better in between his ropes. And Yokozuna subsequently squared a rather difficult circle for him. He was absolutely massive, but he passed airport tests in public and drug tests behind the scenes. Win-win. He was getting rocket strapped, and right around the time that he was being spoken about as the favourite for that year's Royal Rumble, WWE revealed that for the first time, whoever won that match would actually get themselves a spot in the main event of WrestleMania 9. Virgil was ultimately prescient in warning the Hitman. If Bret Hart did manage to hold on to that gold all the way to the show of shows, there was a pretty strong chance he was going to come face to face with a monster. That proved truer than anybody could have forecast, but, you know, more on that later. Yoko did win the Rumble, of course, and the booking couldn't have really done more with the limitations of the field to get him over in the body of the match too. He took out Earthquake just to make it very clear that he was the new bull of these woods. He was kept far away from The Undertaker in the knowledge that that program was rainy day stuff, and could very well be several of them ahead. And perhaps most notably, he was given a relatively fresh Randy Savage to dominate and eliminate during the closing stretch. One that made the Macho Man look overwhelmed to the point of stupidity before being eliminated via pinfall attempt kickout. He got what he deserved. Zuna was in every sense unstoppable and a big ol' problem for the excellence of execution to solve. With the match as good as set then, after Hart had managed to see off Razor Ramon at the Rumble, WWE decided to turn the heat upon Yokozuna. Though Bret Hart was, you know, Canadian, Vince McMahon liked what he liked, and promoting a xenophobic heel was safe ground at an unstable time for the company. The gimmick was to pivot hard into an anti-American stance. The rhetoric was dated and not even in keeping with any global social unrest McMahon had typically had no problem promoting in the past. But Fuji and his Japanese monster were now interested in more than just dominating the World Wrestling Federation and all of its babyface stars. They wanted to crush the US of A too. Jim Duggan, one of the last patriotic holdovers from the bygone era, wanted to do something about it, because of course he did. But Yokozuna's aura was so well established and worth protecting at this point that the two didn't even build a match on television. It was merely a knockdown challenge on account of the fact that the #1 contender couldn't even be floored during a singles match. And while Duggan was more than up for knocking down Yokozuna, he was mainly just in it to stop his opponent knocking down America. A nervous fire simmered in the cautious opening stages, but appeared to be extinguished when, after a couple of attempts, Duggan did the impossible and knocked Zuna on his ass. The live crowd went absolutely berserk, subjectively suggesting that the people were actually buying into the whole package. But the joy was short-lived as the #1 contender moved to assuage his embarrassment. He cut short Duggan's flag-waving celebrations by throwing a big bucket of salt at him and then hitting him with a suplex and a leg drop, as you do. And after that, the blinded and unconscious Duggan was left for dead after not one, not two, not three, but 4 bonsai drops, including a final one in which the American flag was draped over his lifeless body. It's just not cricket. On the surface, it couldn't have really been more effective. What emerged, no matter how dated it might have been, was the shared understanding that Yokozuna hated America, that his finisher was the deadliest kill shot in the company, and that he wasn't afraid of using salt as a shortcut should anybody get close to putting him away. These were all things that factored into the original main event of WrestleMania 9, of course. Right down to Hart being blinded by Fuji's salt when he had the monster's legs locked in a sharpshooter. The foreshadowing was for naught when Hulk Hogan just trampled over both of them moments later, annoyingly. But they were actually lucky to get there with the story still in one piece. Complaints about both the representation of Japanese people and the desecration of the American flag moved some networks to heavily edit or even remove elements of the angle, unaware that this was only the beginning of the content that would ultimately define WWE's main event scene for the next 12 months. Scraping through the protests, WWE repurposed the bit slightly with a more direct goal in mind, having Yoko ram a table into Bret Hart's ribs during a contract signing as a shortcut to flattening him too. Now crucially, the cameras stuck around to find the hitman gamely getting back to his feet. But never had a babyface champion looked in such jeopardy heading into the biggest show of the year. The concern was well founded, and after Mr. Fuji's aforementioned chicanery, Bret Hart was left painfully squinting at the Nevada sky. Oh, what's happened? For less than a minute, that is, before Hulk Hogan just arrived and squashed the new champion after he stupidly accepted an impromptu match there and then. I mean, what were you thinking, Yoko? McMahon had pressed the red and yellow panic button at possibly the worst time ever, completely hijacking both his new babyface and heel in service of Hogan's ego and what remained of his drawing power. That thankfully wasn't enough to maintain their fraying relationship, and while Hart definitely should have been the person to win the belt back, Hogan was just too shrewd to pass the torch to his obvious replacement, wasn't he? Not a chance, brother. Yokozuna got the nod instead, and with it a rare pinfall victory over the Hulkster at King of the Ring 1993. And though political games might have been at the heart of Hogan's decision to lose to the sumo heel, the victory itself was shockingly definitive, save for a cheating cameraman shooting fire into the champion's face. Only in wrestling. Yokozuna kicked out of the leg drop, pinned Hogan with one of his own, and after all that, then dragged him into the corner for a post-match bonsai drop, as the commentators candidly spoke about the possible death of Hulkamania. Had the industry at large been a bit hotter, this would have probably been a bit of a shockwave, really. As it was, though, the scene just played out as an effective but inevitable case of a dated legend being put out to pasture once and for all. On the same show, Bret Hart worked 3 times in 3 totally different matches to win the titular tournament, and also kickstart a series with Jerry Lawler that was to keep him busy until around, I don't know, Royal Rumble season. And in the absence of a top babyface, Yokozuna just decided to challenge the entirety of the United States of America. Pretty bold strategy. The July 4th, 1993 Stars and Stripes Yokozuna Body Slam Challenge was a textbook example of how dynamic WWE could still be, even when things had never been worse for the market leader commercially. Set to the gorgeous sunshine of New York City, a host of wrestlers and sports stars all lined up to try and, well, body slam Yokozuna. There was the implication that a title shot might beckon for the winner, but this wasn't like a Royal Rumble or Money in the Bank kind of situation. It wasn't guaranteed. This was merely athletes lining up for the good of Uncle Sam, damn it! And honestly, the entire thing was presented so damn well, it did genuinely feel like Yokozuna was crushing the spirit of the entire nation every time someone failed to pick him up. This had actually been another excellent offshoot of the Hogan match. Hogan always got his opponents up and over for the slam, it didn't matter how big they were or how impossible the feat seemed. Toppling the evil Earthquake in 1990, for example, came with the promise of a slam just baked in there. I mean, this was the dude that slammed Andre the Giant, he could do anything. This was just how monsters were vanquished in WWE, and Yokozuna was proving to be the most dangerous of them all for being too big for even the mighty Hulkster or anybody to do that job. Even Randy Savage, relegated to a hosting job most of the day, failed alongside fellow former WWE champion Bob Backlund and collegiate standouts the Steiner brothers. Crush was months away from embracing Mr. Fuji and Japanese culture in a story that was started with his confidence being absolutely wrecked here, along with some of the muscles in his back. The whole scene just called out for a hero when none were forthcoming. But it fell to a heel who suddenly decided that the one thing more important than marveling at his own biceps was that Star-Spangled Banner. Lex Luger landed via helicopter and just shoved his manager Bobby Heenan out the way, denoting that he was about to turn. One flex of those famous biceps and a hip toss later, well, Lex Luger was on his way to SummerSlam, baby, with the hopes and dreams of millions of Americans, or perhaps more accurately, like hundreds and thousands, resting on on his chiseled shoulders. And if the body slam challenge hadn't been audacious enough, Vince McMahon's bananas plan to create an instant replacement for Hulk Hogan was next level jingoism. Luger rode a call to action campaign bus across America throughout the summer, ostensibly electioneering for the title shot, but in reality just looking to garner support where just a few weeks earlier there'd been none. Oh yeah, and SummerSlam 93 had a poster of Yokozuna jumping on the American flag with the tagline, "Somebody has to stop him," as if he'd morphed from heel champion to national recognized threat. For a man with familial roots in the wrestling business running way deeper than Luger's, it surely had to be amusing from Rodney Anoa'i's side. But he performed gamely in the role too, doubling down on his hatred of the USA, and even adding Jim Cornette to his fold as a more acerbic mouthpiece and kayfabe legal. The stage was seemingly set for the champion to fall, but in a, let's call it a choice of an ending at SummerSlam, he did, but via countout. As the narcissist, Luger had used an elbow strike with his surgical steel plate inside as his finisher. He'd been forced to wear a pad to supposedly offset the damage as a heel, but as a babyface he decked it in the flag along with every other inch of his body and tried his best to have a fair fight. And when the match inevitably broke down, Luger took a chance and cleaned Yoko's clock. But then the title holder collapsed to the floor and lost by countout. It was a bizarre non-committal of an ending really, but played out as if the Lex Express and everything after July 4th had been leading right to this Pyrrhic victory. In real life, Vince McMahon was just suddenly a little bit uncertain about Luger's, well, precise potential in that spot. So he just elected to potentially delay the crowning until WrestleMania instead. This was at least a tacit show of approval to Yokozuna as champion too, and he was about to enter into a far more appealing program now that Hart and Luger were both potentially in the frame for a grandest stage showdown at Madison Square Garden in March. For the first time in nearly 4 years, the ever-present and ever-dominant Undertaker was about to be written out of storylines. In a memorable transition of the heat from Luger to the Deadman, the Survivor Series found the Undertaker stepping in to replace Tatanka, who lost his undefeated streak and pay-per-view spot thanks to the injury sustained at the hands and posterior of Yokozuna. Ludwig Borger had been the one to decisively pin the Native American, and the elimination match pitting the All-Americans against the Foreign Fanatics climaxed with a Borger-Luger showdown in order for the babyfaces to prevail. Well, it ended with that at least. It really actually climaxed when the Undertaker completely no-sold being slammed face first into the steel steps, and Yoko's face was a picture. It was incredible. It was a money moment at a time when nothing really drew, and the two worked a casket match at the 1994 Royal Rumble to capitalize on the genuine emotion and set the stage for the Undertaker's hiatus. Having sold enough fear for the casket itself that fans could actually buy a title change, Yoko, Fuji and Cornette enlisted the help of pretty much every single villain on the roster just to try and beat up Taker and stuff him in a casket. Notable here was a brief moment of solidarity between the Samoans, as Yoko, Afa and the Headshrinkers made a carving up gesture that the cameras caught just enough of to acknowledge the bond. The road from one WrestleMania to the next had been full of some earnestly sensational twists and turns, but Yokozuna's impact within that time had been undeniable. He'd put Hulk Hogan and The Undertaker down and out of the company, staved off Lex Luger, Randy Savage and other big hitters, and had survived a television title defense against Bret Hart in a manner that suggested that he'd be able to do it again if they met down the road. That meeting came at WrestleMania 10, and with it the beginning of a very protracted end. After losing the WWE Championship at WrestleMania, Yokozuna teamed with Crush to lose to the Headshrinkers. He then spent the rest of the year setting up a return loss to The Undertaker that came at the Survivor Series. He'd disappear then until WrestleMania 11 the following spring, in the first of several breaks designed to help him lose some of the weight he gained since hitting the road with the company full-time way back in 1992. The story sadly repeated itself multiple times between then and his tragic passing in 2000 though, as Yokozuna's size visibly increased on screen. As Owen Hart's surprise tag team partner, he served a fun purpose throughout most of 1995, but the physical limitations were showing even when he wasn't required to work the entirety of a contest. Breaks in 1996 were yet again thrown in to try and help him shift a bit of weight, but he continued to miss more targets than he hit. And he wrestled just 2 matches in the last few months of the year before another departure that proved make or break. As 1997 became the year that everything changed in WWE, one truly domineering figure, well, he missed all of it. Numerous stories suggested that Yoko was destined for the Hart Foundation during their anti-America peak, having previously worked alongside and against Bret Hart, Owen Hart, and Davey Boy Smith. But the numbers on the scales only got bigger, and he was officially released in 1998 when multiple state athletic commissions would not clear him to compete. After working independent dates where he was able to perform, Rodney Anoa'i passed away in October 2000 during a UK tour with All Star Wrestling. He was just 34 years old, and that is no age at all. Though there had been whispers of a comeback to WWE during his final years, his legacy was actually being brilliantly honoured by none other than former ally Fatu. When Rikishi Fatu burst back onto the screens in the summer of 1999, he was met with equal doses of warmth and shock. The face was instantly recognisable, and WWE weren't trying to obscure it. The name was even a nod to the former Headshrinker, but updated in another sign of the times attempt to squash the new generation into the Attitude Era. The recognition collided with just how much Fatu had increased in size, and how WWE were choosing to exploit it. Rikishi was a dangerous and imposing man, of course, but a sense of humour clearly lurked under there if he was willing to put his buttocks out there for the masses, hidden only by a thong sumo attire hybrid. And this was an outfit that paid unique tribute to Yoko, while simultaneously encouraging fans, commentators, and wrestlers to, crack jokes about his massive ass. Like so many others who broke big during this era, he had the benefit of the doubt from a lot of brand new eyes. Those that might have seen some clips of the Headshrinkers over the years, but wouldn't recognise Making a Difference Fatu if he'd done a say no to drugs talk at their school. WWE was white hot in 1999, and the difference in perceptions for performers that may as well have been mainstays was apparent. The magic moment for Rikishi came when he was linked up with Too Cool Baby, alongside fellow recently repackaged regulars Brian Christopher and Scott Taylor. When you look at the characters Too Sexy and Scotty Too Hotty, you break them down, they were pretty much goof heels, weren't they? But the pair played their roles with such gusto that fans just gravitated towards the silliness of it all, and can you really blame them? Rikishi was theoretically good muscle for them, but because the act as a trio instantly became a babyface one, well, the script flipped, and it all became about him doing their bits rather than the other way around. When the monster dropped the facade and sported the shades for a post-victory dance, the money-drawing act was complete. Considered to many a shorthand for the fabulous creative freedom that was on show throughout this period, Too Cool and Rikishi's act was the sort of thing that could have only gotten that over in a hot time. But the three experienced workers made sure to maximise this amazing moment in the sun. They constantly added in-character choices to big spots to enhance the value for the live crowd. Sexy rubbed his ridiculous goggles before hitting his hip-hop drop leg drop. Scotty famously incorporated the worm into his comebacks as a sort of mid-card people's elbow. And Rikishi, well, Rikishi shoved his ass in people's faces. The stink face was quite a disgusting and fundamentally flawed piece of offense, yes. But over's over, and the spot is still over a quarter of a century later that wrestlers can start entire Twitter storms just by unleashing one on a house show. You know exactly what I'm talking about. And looking back, it definitely got the right kind of heat as well. Evolving from a mid-match comedy spot, it eventually became like the ultimate punishment for a heel. Gross-out comedy was huge in 2000, and WWE now had an upper mid-card babyface that was incorporating it into his act in a way that even the likes of Steve Austin and The Rock couldn't. The number 1 and 2 babyfaces respectively in WWE by 1999, and the same but awkwardly reversed in 2000. That summer though, having strapped up his working boots for matches against Triple H, Kurt Angle, Chris Benoit, Val Venus, and many more, Rikishi actually somehow comfortably found himself in the 3rd place babyface spot. In a woefully misguided attempt to capitalise on his popularity and deliver a bombshell payoff to the biggest angle of the prior year though, WWE just killed his babyface momentum dead by having him reveal himself as the person that ran over Steve Austin so his cousin The Rock could ascend. The kayfabe rationale hung together until, well, it didn't. Rikishi reasoned that WWE were never going to let a Samoan wrestler be the top guy, so he stepped in to help The Rock get to the top of the mountain. His own rise, he noted, had been a supplemental benefit. Now, Rock was unquestionably the top man on the show as Austin recovered, but the racism reasoning didn't really hold enough water 4 years and 5 WWE Championship reigns into The Rock's run. Following the reveal, Austin gobbled up Rikishi in revenge brawls. And a feud with Rock himself didn't salvage the turn either, really. Rather than acknowledge the scale of the screw-up though, WWE just performed emergency surgery on the whole thing, by making Rikishi nothing more than a hitman doing Triple H's dirty work. He was sadly marginalised from there, and never was that clearer than when he was thrown into a heel tag team with Haku after he'd just come back from WCW in 2001. And then by the end of the year, he was a babyface once again. And if you fancy a bit of only in 2000s WWE trivia, then do I have the trivia for you. Rikishi's run as an Attitude Era relic on SmackDown undercards lasted 3 times as long as his 2000 peak before he was, let go in 2004. With The Rock also parting ways formally with the group around the same time, the last remaining Samoan with visibility on the main roster was Matthew Anoa'i, son of Sika, brother of Roman Reigns. He was working as Rosie, the Hurricane's sidekick, you remember. It was undercard fluff for Anoa'i following the collapse of an intriguing heel run as part of 3-Minute Warning, a team alongside Eddie Jamal Fatu that debuted in 2000 before then being ended in 2003 after Eddie was fired for his part in a bar fight. Anoa'i was then released in 2006, but interestingly not before 3-Minute Warning actually reunited in a dark match in January when Fatu was rehired. Anoa'i sadly saw the door before the team could gather steam again, but Fatu was given a new gimmick that rolled the clock back several decades to the days of the Wild Samoans. Such stereotyping understandably drew derision before the character was rolled out on the post-WrestleMania 22 edition of Monday Night Raw, but as the newly christened Umaga prepared to work the biggest match of WrestleMania 23 just like a year later, well, those critics were forced to eat their words, weren't they, and a taped up thumb. Against the grain and against the odds, the Samoan Bulldozer actually turned out to be one of the biggest success stories of the decade. Umaga burst onto the scene the night after WrestleMania 22 by battering Ric Flair on behalf of his manager Armando Alejandro Estrada. And WWE loved his brutality so much they just decided to go route one on his push. The character might have looked and even felt a little bit out of date at first, but fans back winners, and that is exactly what Umaga did week after week after week during his first year. Shrewdly kept away from John Cena for much of that, he was often deployed as hired muscle on Estrada's behalf, which helped him mix in with some of the other major heels when alliances were required. January 2007 then saw his streak ended by a banana skin loss to John Cena, of course, but then that all set up an epic last man standing match at the Royal Rumble. It's one that many consider to be the best match that either man ever had, and possibly the best in the stipulation's history. It was a gloriously bloody war, and how was Umaga rewarded? Well, he was connected to the organization's biggest feud they had coming into WrestleMania. He was to be Vince McMahon's in-ring avatar against Donald Trump's chosen representative Bobby Lashley in a battle of the Billionaires. The bout was refereed by Stone Cold Steve Austin, and it all ended with McMahon getting his head shaved. Wonder what that feels like. It drew the house, as it were, and the Samoan Bulldozer was right there front and center. 3 major defeats were unfortunately 3 too many for a gimmick that was always riskily one-dimensional though. Further losses alongside Vince and Shane McMahon should have fed into a babyface turn for the well-liked monster, particularly after fans went wild for the makeshift team of Umaga and Cena during a random episode of Raw that summer. Alas, he was turned heel because another babyface needed him on that side of the divide. Triple H returned from injury at SummerSlam, and Umaga was deemed the perfect foil for the game for much of the second half of 07. After bouncing around the mid-card between 08 and 09, he was then released in June 2009, when it emerged that he'd refused to enter rehab after a failure of the company's wellness policy. Rumours did trickle through that he was potentially set to return at the 2010 Royal Rumble, but reality had a different plan. Umaga passed away in 2009 at just 36 years old, another one of too many tragedies of wrestlers dying way too young. But not the first from the iconic family tree to pass away before their time either. With such a big family obviously comes love and legacy, but also significant loss. More of the wrestlers mentioned in this list have passed than those that remain around today to see the very real successes of the family. Rocky roads have persistently resulted in incredible outcomes for the family too. I mean, just ask Roman Reigns and The Rock. The positions they currently hold at the very tippy top of professional wrestling were not arrived at with any kind of ease, even when WWE were looking to make the path as smooth as humanly possible. If anything, both suffered the consequences of the company rolling out the red carpet for them as babyfaces. All because they'd seen the quality of the work and the real life people and just assumed that audiences would too. I mean, how wrong they were. When Umaga's run was such a surprise hit, it also unlocked a new compromise between old values and new that could now be reached. Day-to-day representation of the Samoan family tree sits primarily with the latest incarnation of the Bloodline and the excommunicated Usos. Sons of Rikishi, Jimmy and Jey Uso, who are known as Jonathan and Joshua outside of the ring if you didn't know, eventually became integral to the success of the Bloodline between 2020 and 2023, with Jey's bold exit from and Jimmy's desperate re-entry into the group driving a WrestleMania 40 match between the two brothers. Now, it was a bit of a bad match, sadly, but the journey the pair had been on to get to that point over a decade after their debut, well, that may one day claim its rightful place as the real cinema behind the endless superkicks. Their 2010 debut on the main roster was about as non-committal as, well, anything else on the show at that point. They were heels alongside Tamina Snuka, and more than a few allusions were made to their lineage, but it was all still a bit half in, half out. They taped their thumbs like Umaga without ever really deploying Samoan spikes. They borrowed the Headshrinkers / Snuka finishers for what would ultimately become known as the Uso Splash. They incorporated historic iconography into their aesthetics, but they were never really given promo time to flesh the characters out beyond the commentators drilling down the family bonds every week. By 2010, this simply wasn't enough either. WWE had attempted to make legacy a thing audiences cared about. You remember? They were like a group of second and third generation wrestlers all together. But the WrestleMania payoff that year between founder members Randy Orton, Cody Rhodes and Ted DiBiase Jr. played out to virtual silence. That stable hadn't exactly done right by Bloodline lore either. Afa Anoa'i Jr., son of Afa, brother of Samu, was, in kayfabe as Manu, deemed too useless to hold down a permanent place in that group. The Usos then toiled for years in what was effectively the worst spot on WWE's main roster. Vince McMahon historically hated tag team wrestling, and the majority of the time the Usos weren't even fighting for the belts. This also robbed them of spots on WrestleMania's main card for a period of time that begged belief. Despite debuting in 2010, they had to wait until WrestleMania 34, 8 years and multiple tag team title reigns into their run on the show before they got a spot on what was then a seriously bloated show of shows. It was overdue reward for a series of cult classic matches between 2013 and 2016, with those matches coming against the likes of The Shield, the Wyatt family, Tyson Kidd and Cesaro, and The New Day. The latter unit were actually key to Jimmy and Jey making that next move up the ladder. Big E, Xavier Woods and Kofi Kingston's tremendous talent and sheer force of will had just injected this division with a much-needed new burst of energy. And at long last, the Usos actually stood a chance of being able to benefit from all their hard work. Prior to mid-2016, the only reward afforded to them really was, well, job security, but the pair wanted to thrive rather than just survive. Fierce in-ring consistency during the era, alongside a pivot to an aesthetic that mirrored elements of their Samoan heritage, ensured they were two of the more vital spokes on WWE's ever-changing wheel. But the return of WWE split rosters was a door they aggressively superkicked down. Drafted to SmackDown Live, a loss in a tag title tournament to American Alpha resulted in the veterans snapping on the NXT call-ups. After this, they then threw out a promo on the much-missed Talking Smack post-show, and it was here when they explained that the play hard in the paint smiles might have to take a back seat to them earning respect through violence. With that came a new look 1 week later, a new and far superior entrance the week after that, and in less than 6 months they were SmackDown Tag Team Champions on a show they ostensibly owned. They were cooking. The biggest and best challenge they'd ever face emerged following a post-WrestleMania shakeup though, as the New Day arrived on the blue brand as beloved babyfaces. What followed was a summer series of Undercard Classics. Comfortably the company's best feud of the year from an in-ring point of view, they took their contest from pre-shows to pay-per-views, trading the belts in blinding efforts at Battleground and Hell in a Cell, on SmackDown itself in a Sin City street fight, and most notably in a Match of the Year contender on the SummerSlam kickoff. The kickoff! By year's end, the two teams had built up such mutual respect that Jimmy and Jey were now babyfaces once again, and the aforementioned WrestleMania 34 debut saw them enter that show as tag team champions. About damn time. They then worked tag title matches on the card every single year until their WrestleMania 40 singles showdown, including fittingly the Night 1 WrestleMania 39 main event against Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens as the Bloodline Bloodline saga ruled the wrestling world. It was an incredible full circle moment for the brothers, the angle itself, and the Samoan wrestling dynasty, headlining both shows with overlapping stories that continue to carry WWE on past WrestleMania to even greater heights. Roman Reigns and the Usos specifically were the acts that best exemplified Samoan heritage entering its perfect final form, after decades of close calls and near misses. Even when briefly cast as a babyface bloodline at various points between 2015 and 2019, the trio never really felt as dominant as their headline spot suggested. They were a bit naff, let's be honest. An image of them covering Baron Corbin in dog food during the January 31st, 2020 edition of the show scanned as a big win, but was in fact all three at something of a low ebb. And though Roman was heading back to the main event and likely a chorus of boos to boot, there was nothing but more tag team treadmill stuff in Jimmy and Jay's future. The pandemic resulting in Roman's exit was everything for the three. With it came the subservience of Jay after two brutal defeats at Clash of Champions and Hell in a Cell 2020, and the folding in of Jimmy in 2021 resulted in the subsequent rise and fall of Roman's empire. They were the real-life best and the kayfabe worst of times for the family. And with big matches and pivotal spots yet again key to WrestleMania's success in 2024, what felt like the finishing of a story at WrestleMania was in fact just the continuation of a much bigger one featuring several of this current generation's main characters. Cody's mantra had been wrestling has more than one royal family from the very second that he stepped away from the McMahon version of it. And he returned in 2022 to prove his point, but he had not accounted for just how right he was. At WrestleMania 39, he had to take down Roman Reigns and the Usos, acting under instruction from the elders from back in 2020, before being felled by a hooded Solo Sikoa. It took an army of babyfaces to help him ascend at long last 1 year later, and had it not already been the case, Philadelphia well and truly confirmed itself as a cursed location for The Rock and Roman Reigns following the events of WrestleMania. The city of brotherly love had been a cauldron of hate in 2015 when the cousins stood side by side at the conclusion of a Royal Rumble, which many class as probably the worst in the company's history. The chill that just went up my spine. The Rock was by then an unflappably popular special guest, but the sheer venom directed towards his cousin as the organization's chosen one was reflective of a changing tide that even his raised eyebrow couldn't arrest. In fact, it was the Great One's confused and frustrated look towards the Wells Fargo crowd that pretty much defined the ugly scene. That building had actually booed him before, but even when he came up against Stone Cold Steve Austin at WrestleMania 15, they were charmed by his antics. The same could not be said for the crowd in 2015 though. They were hating what he stood for and hating him, and The Rock was not coming back to WWE to be hated. Not then anyway. It wasn't a misread of the room by The Rock so much as a misunderstanding of the creative problems within the company, all thanks to a Vince McMahon growing even more stubborn the older and more out of step he became. The Roman Reigns push had been a disaster with multiple tendrils. The two cousins coming together should have been a dream moment to eventually foreshadow a dream match, and instead, a nightmare just overwhelmed everything. Sound familiar? Lol. In 2024, fans once again rejected The Rock and Roman Reigns, and it frankly doesn't bear thinking about how Philadelphia would have reacted if WWE had stuck to the original plan of having The Rock challenge Roman Reigns for the big belt at WrestleMania. They would have gone mad. But the nightmare was one of a much different kind this time around, and it was the result, thankfully, of some good booking rather than bad. Cody Rhodes' story just needed to be finished, and The Rock's return very nearly destroyed all that before an all-timer of a pivot occurred 6 days after it looked like Reigns and Cody's rematch had been put on ice just so the Tribal Chief could fight his cousin. Back within the realms of kayfabe, the Tribal Chief and newly christened Final Boss were now being booed because that was all part of the plan, rather than being a protest. And as both looked up at the bright lights and the Philly night sky following the pain of defeat, the dawning of a new chapter in this rich history was inevitable. If history informs the future, the most recent crop of Samoan family members will yet again have to subvert stereotypes and force their way back into the conversation. But with the silent backing of Rock and or Roman, committed booking, and strong, believable work that has defined generations dating back decades, as you've just seen in this video, it'd be naive to assume they won't be next in line to justify the historic blood oath and make their elders proud.